For years, Dead by Daylight players begged Behavior, the developers, for a matchmaking system based purely on skill, instead of whatever haphazard rank-based matchmaking we had before. The rank-based matchmaking is a joke, they cried. It's too easy to get to rank 1 as Survivor. We might as well all just be playing for fun. Can you imagine? Playing for fun? What kind of idiots were they taking us for? Players with thousands of hours started to drop like flies, abandoning Dead by Daylight like it was a sinking ship. The game was truly on its last legs, on the brink of total collapse. Not even the Resident Evil chapter could save it, and that chapter brought us the RPD map. Behavior's backs were against the wall, and with the Hellraiser chapter on the way, they knew that something had to be done. At long last, in September of 2021, the people had their prayers answered, and skill-based matchmaking was officially implemented into the game. It worked like a charm. Players who had sworn off ever touching the game again came back in droves, a trend we're still seeing today as player counts skyrocket. Upon release, Behavior proudly stated that SBMM would bring about fairer, more balanced matches in which survivors and killers alike would have chances to escape or sacrifice within 5% of the average 75% of the time. The chance of survival averaged across all skill levels at the time was about 50%, which means that, as far as Behavior are concerned, a match was fair if 2 survivors escaped and 2 survivors were sacrificed. There's a problem with this reasoning, however, because by Behavior's judgment, a match can only be deemed fair or balanced if 2 survivors escaped and 2 were sacrificed. Rather than try to predict how fair or balanced a match will be by analysing the elements of game design of which the game is made up, they instead look at quantitative data in the form of broad statistics to determine whether or not a game was fair retroactively. It doesn't matter what mistakes the survivors made or whether or not the killer mind-gamed the survivors into making them. If more than 2 of them die, the killer was clearly inherently more skilled at the game and should therefore be playing against survivors who are also more inherently skilled. When you determine whether or not a game was fair based purely on results that come after the fact, you ignore entirely the responsibility each player had towards the result. And when you judge each survivor's outcome individually, rather than together as a team, you ignore the fact that survivors rely on each other to survive. At the time of recording this, though, Behavior has said this is something that they are working towards changing. Take the Nia in this clip, for instance. She runs straight to the ridiculous dead-end palette on the game, which, as the twins, allows me to body block her there while I send out Victor, until I either change back to Charlotte and down her, or another survivor completes the generator that opens the door behind her. The decision that she made to run through this palette resulted in a negative consequence for her and her team, and was part of the larger narrative of the game that led to me winning in the end. And of course it was. She ran into a dead end and got body blocked, while I went and downed another survivor. There should be consequences for that. According to skill-based matchmaking, though, she is inherently unskilled, and so she should play against killers who are less skilled, and I'm inherently skilled and should play against survivors who are more skilled. She doesn't have to learn the map well enough to know that there's a dead end behind that palette, and I now have to play against survivors who make fewer mistakes and know the maps better. Because there is no incentive to increase my hidden MMR rating, raising it is basically a punishment. In this case, it works out like this. Nia makes a mistake and faces negative consequences in-game, but all of the responsibility for her mistake is thrust onto me by raising my MMR rating to play against opponents who won't make that kind of mistake. Nia had every opportunity to run somewhere that wasn't a dead end, which means that she had a higher chance to escape me than the result might suggest. But the current SBMM system only takes the result into consideration, not the decisions that players made along the way to the result. Even if it wasn't a mistake purely on the survivor's part, and it was a mind game in which the killer hid their red stain or tricked the survivor at a tile with line of sight blockers, the survivor could still have had a 50% chance of evading them. If the survivor is caught, it doesn't necessarily mean that the killer is more skilled than the survivor, nor would the reverse necessarily be true. Skill-based matchmaking in its current form is patronizing to players who make mistakes, survivors and killers alike, whether it's because they were outplayed by someone who was more knowledgeable about the game, or because they lost a mind game or two along the way to the result. So long as there is no incentive for players to raise their MMR, skill-based matchmaking will never be beneficial to high MMR players, aside maybe from solo survivors who should have better teammates than before. So long as survivors have their MMR ratings raised or lowered individually rather than as a team while they endure relentless tunneling and camping, again this is something Behavior have said is going to change, the game will always feel inherently unfair, not because the killer was too skilled for them, but because they genuinely didn't have a 50% chance to raise their MMR. When I'm tunneled out of the game early, I want my sacrifice to be taken into consideration when the results are reviewed. because otherwise it feels like it was for nothing and I'm just being punished for being targeted by the killer like we're in a 1v1. But again, this hinges on players wanting to raise their MMR. It's patronizing to experienced, knowledgeable players to implement SBMM not to reward players for winning, but to protect the ones who lose. Losing in Dead by Daylight can feel pretty bad, maybe worse than any other game I've ever played, because of its inherently unbalanced and unfair nature as an asymmetrical game. For me, it feels worse to lose as killer because I was 100% of the team, whereas if I lose as survivor, the responsibility is generally shared amongst 4 people. That said, it can feel bad to lose as survivor because your teammates threw the game in a way that you couldn't control or from which you couldn't come back. Losing in Dead by Daylight is also entirely unique from losing in other games because it's difficult to know where to draw the line when taking responsibility for why you lost. Was it a decision or series of decisions or commitments you made? Maybe you didn't know something about a certain map or tile, like how Victor will interact with certain objects or walls when pouncing, or where totems can spawn while you were looking for one to bless with what could have been a game-saving circle of healing. There are so many variables in any given match of DBD that it can be overwhelming to figure out what you did wrong. It can be something completely abstract, like which direction you chose to move right at the beginning of the game, which comes down to knowledge of where players can spawn. SBMM is a deterrent to improvement, learning and growth in players as they try to navigate the chaotic, abstract landscape that is Dead by Daylight. When you try to homogenize every match into a 2-man escape and only match people based on statistical results, you create a separation in the player base between players who raise their MMR and players who don't. What works at low MMR might not work at high MMR, and a low MMR player might be confused and frustrated that their go-to strategies aren't working if they play against high MMR players. But rather than imploring players of all MMR ratings and skill levels to improve and aim for high MMR ratings through learning and getting better, thereby unifying the player base and improving matchmaking overall, you're imposing imaginary skill ceilings through which players don't know how to break and therefore keeping them where they are. According to the results of matchmaking tests at the end of March and beginning of April in 2022, just over a month ago at the time of recording this, high-level players wanted more variety in their matches and mid to low-level players wanted more even matches. Rather than incentivizing mid to low-level players to improve at the game to raise their chances of escaping or sacrificing, SBMM panders to the aforementioned complaints about even matches at the cost of trapping high-level players in a hell bracket somewhere high up and away from everyone else. Rather than earning a better chance to escape or sacrifice, it's handed to players in a way that is, to the point of this entire video, patronizing. That brings us to the end of the video. If you liked it, you can let me know by pressing the like button, and I'll know to keep making more videos like these. Thanks for watching either way, and I'll smile you later.